The battle had been over for hours, but the wreckage still burned in the darkness of space. Commander Ethan Carter moved carefully through the floating debris, his suit's thrusters pushing him forward. His visor's display flashed warnings. Oxygen was running low, and radiation levels were rising. He should have left by now. But he couldn't. Not when there was still a chance that someone had survived. His squad had already returned to the U.S. Vanguard, their mission completed. The Scifi warship, once a sleek silver titan, was now a graveyard. Enemy or not, no one deserved to die alone in the void. Ethan moved deeper into the wreckage, using his flashlight to scan the twisted corridors. The walls were scorched, sparks flickering from broken panels. Bodies of the Scifi crew floated lifelessly, their dark armor cracked and torn. He checked his scanner. One life sign. Weak. Close. His heart pounded as he kicked forward, turning a corner. Then he saw her. A young Scifi female lay trapped under a fallen beam. Her deep blue skin was smeared with dark blood, her silver eyes barely open. The Scifi were a cold, logical race, never showing emotions, never asking for help. But as she turned her head and saw him, something flickered in her gaze. Fear. And then, hope. Ethan didn't hesitate. He gripped the metal beam and activated his exosuit's servo boosters. With a grunt, he lifted the heavy debris, tossing it aside. The girl gasped in pain but didn't scream. Scifi never screamed. "I've got you," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. He reached for his medkit, quickly sealing the worst of her wounds. She flinched but didn't resist. Her breathing was shallow. If he didn't move fast, she wouldn't make it. "This is Carter," he spoke into his comm. "I found a survivor, preparing for evac." A voice crackled back. "Commander, we need to go now. That ship is falling apart." Ethan glanced at the crumbling corridor. The ship's reactor core was unstable. Any minute now, it would explode. He looked back at the Scifi girl. Her silver eyes locked onto his. She was scared, but more than that, she didn't want to be left behind. Ethan made his decision. Ignoring the pain in his muscles, he lifted her into his arms and activated his thrusters. The ship groaned as metal twisted around them. He pushed forward, dodging falling debris, flames reflecting off his visor. A sudden explosion rocked the corridor behind them. No time. He sped up, his arms tightening around her. Her breathing grew weaker, her grip on his suit loosening. "Stay with me," he muttered. "We're almost there." The airlock was just ahead. Through the small window, he saw his ship, his home, waiting for him. A final burst from his thrusters sent them through the airlock. As the doors sealed behind them, he collapsed to the floor, the Scifi girl still in his arms. "Get us out of here," he shouted. The ship's engines roared to life. Outside, the remains of the Scifi warship detonated in a brilliant explosion, its light fading into the endless black. Ethan let out a breath, his heart still racing. He looked down at the girl in his arms. She was still alive. Barely. Her silver eyes fluttered open, staring at him with an intensity he couldn't understand. Then, in a weak, trembling voice, she spoke. "You saved me." Ethan blinked. Scifi never expressed gratitude, never owed debts. But as her fingers tightened around his sleeve, he realized something. She wasn't letting go. And something told him she never would. Ethan Carter sat on the edge of the medical bay, watching the Scifi girl resting in the containment pod. The soft blue glow of the stasis field highlighted her deep blue skin and silver eyes, now half open but still hazy with weakness. She was alive, but she wasn't acting like a normal Scifi. Most Scifi were known for their cold logic. They followed strict rules, showed no emotions, and never formed attachments. Yet ever since Ethan had saved her, she refused to look away from him. She watched his every move, silent and unblinking. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had been in plenty of strange situations before, but this was new. The medbay door hissed open, and Dr. Helena Ross stepped in, carrying a tablet. "She's stable," she said, glancing at the readings. "Her body is healing faster than I expected. Zolvan biology is impressive." Ethan nodded. "That's good. Has she said anything else?" Dr. Ross hesitated. "Not much. But she won't stop staring at you." Ethan frowned and turned back to the Zolvan girl. Her silver eyes were still locked on him, intense and unwavering. "Can she understand us?" he asked. "Zolvan have universal translation implants. She understands every word." Dr. Ross folded her arms. "But she won't talk to me. Just you." Ethan exhaled. He didn't know much about Zolvan culture, but he did know one thing. They didn't form bonds with outsiders. And yet, this girl refused to look away. Finally, Ethan decided to try. He stepped closer to the pod. "What's your name?" he asked. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her lips moved. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Karena." Ethan nodded. "All right, Karena. You're safe now." She blinked slowly, then, with a weak but determined voice, she spoke again. "I will not leave you." Ethan froze. "What?" Karena sat up slightly, her arms trembling as she pushed herself up. "I owe you my life." "That's not how this works," Ethan said, rubbing his forehead. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do. You don't owe me anything." She tilted her head, as if trying to understand. "Among my people, when life is given, a life must be returned." Ethan exchanged a glance with Dr. Ross, who raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you're in my debt?" Ethan asked. Karena shook her head. "No, I belong to you now." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Hold on, that's not." Before he could finish, the ship's alarm blared. "Captain to the bridge. We have incoming Zolvan vessels." Ethan's blood ran cold. The Zolvan were here. He turned to Karena. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to darken. She knew this would happen. A dangerous arrival. By the time Ethan reached the bridge, the view screen showed the incoming Zolvan warship. It was sleek and deadly, its silver hull reflecting the light of the nearby stars. Captain Jonas Rourke stood at the command console, arms crossed. "Carter, I don't know what you did, but the Zolvan are demanding we hand over their lost asset." Ethan clenched his jaw. "They're talking about Karena." Rourke turned to him. "She's their citizen, Carter. If they want her back, we might not have a choice." Ethan's fists tightened. Something doesn't feel right. If they just wanted to rescue her, why send a warship? Rourke narrowed his eyes. "You think they want to eliminate her?" Ethan nodded. "Zolvan don't form bonds. If she's acting differently, they might see her as defective." The ship's communication screen activated, revealing a tall Zolvan commander with dark, piercing eyes. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "Human vessel, return our lost one immediately." Rourke stepped forward. "She's injured. We need time before." The Zolvan commander cut him off. "Return her now. No delay." Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a termination order. Before anyone could speak, a soft voice echoed through the bridge. "I refuse." Everyone turned. Karena stood in the doorway, her weak body barely holding itself up. But her eyes burned with something fierce. The Zolvan commander's expression flickered. "You are compromised. You will return, or you will be erased." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Karena and the screen. "She's not going anywhere." The Zolvan commander's gaze hardened. "Then we will take her by force." The screen cut off. A second later, the Zolvan ship powered up its weapons. Ethan turned to Rourke. "They're not going to negotiate." Rourke nodded grimly. "Then we fight." Ethan looked back at Karena. She was watching him again, but now he understood why. She wasn't just following him. She had chosen him, and she wasn't going to let him go. The ship trembled as the first solvent energy blast struck the Vanguard's shields. Red warning lights flashed across the bridge and alarms blared. "Shields at 70%, a crew member called out. Ethan Carter stood firm, his fists clenched. The Solven weren't here for peace. They had come to eliminate Karena. He glanced at her. She stood beside him, her breathing heavy, her blue skin still pale from her injuries. But despite her weakness, her silver eyes burned with determination. "Captain," Ethan said urgently, "we need to move. The Solven won't stop until she's dead." Captain Rourke nodded. "Agreed. Helm, prepare for evasive maneuvers. Tactical, return fire." The Vanguard's laser cannons roared to life, striking the enemy ship. The Solven vessel dodged most of the shots with inhuman precision, but a few blasts hit their shields, sending sparks flying across their hull. Karena suddenly staggered, gripping the console beside her. Ethan reached for her. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly. "I can feel them." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Feel who?" Karena closed her eyes for a brief moment, then whispered, "The Solven crew. Their thoughts. Their emotions. They are afraid of you." Ethan blinked. "Afraid of humans?" Karena nodded. "They do not understand you. Your emotions, your choices. They see your unpredictability as a threat." Ethan's mind raced. He had always known the Solven were different, logical, precise, unemotional. But if they feared human unpredictability, that meant they had no way to counter it. He turned back to the captain. "We can use that against them." Rourke raised an eyebrow. "How?" Ethan took a deep breath. "They expect us to fight like them. Predictable, strategic. But humans, we improvise." The captain gave a small smirk. "All right, Carter. You've got 5 minutes before they punch a hole in my ship. What's your plan?" Ethan turned to Karena. "Can you sense their movements? Their tactics?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. They are linked. Their minds work as one." Ethan grinned. "Good. Then let's break that connection. A battle of minds." As the battle raged on, Ethan and Karena worked quickly. She stood beside him, her breathing steady, her silver eyes glowing faintly. "I will send confusion," she murmured. "Disrupt their thoughts. Make them doubt their orders." Ethan nodded. "And while they're distracted, we strike." Karena closed her eyes, her expression tightening. Ethan couldn't see what she was doing, but he felt something change. The enemy ship hesitated. Their movements slowed. On the screen, the Solven ship's attacks became erratic, missing their targets. Their shields flickered, their precision faltering. "They're losing control," Rourke said in amazement. Ethan smirked. "Then let's finish this." The Vanguard's cannons fired again, this time hitting their mark. A powerful explosion rocked the enemy ship, sending it drifting backward. The Solven ship stopped firing. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, "They're retreating," a crew member reported. Ethan exhaled in relief. The enemy ship turned, its engines flaring as it disappeared into the darkness of space. "They'll be back," Rourke muttered. "But for now, we've won." Ethan looked at Karena. She was breathing heavily, sweat forming on her forehead. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did it." She looked up at him, her silver eyes filled with something new. "Trust." "No," she whispered. "We did it." The truth about the Solven. After the battle, Ethan and Karena sat in a quiet room, away from the chaos of the bridge. "You controlled their minds," Ethan said. "How?" Karena hesitated. "Solven are not like humans. We do not think as individuals. Our minds are linked in a network, guided by logic and reason. That is why we follow orders without question." Ethan frowned. "But you're different." She looked away. "Yes. When you saved me, something changed. I do not know why, but I cannot hear them anymore. I am alone." Ethan's chest tightened. He had never considered what that must feel like, to be cut off from your entire race. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Karena shook her head. "Do not be. Because of this, I understand something my people do not." She met his gaze. "What it means to be free." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. If the Salvan operated as a hive mind, then Karena was an anomaly, a glitch in their perfect system. And that meant they would never stop hunting her. Karena sighed. "They will return, but I will not go back. I choose my own path now." Ethan nodded slowly. She had made her choice. But that choice had put a target on both of them. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Together." Karena gave a small, rare smile. For the first time, she wasn't alone. And neither was he. Ethan Carter stood by the window of his quarters, staring at the vast emptiness of space. The Salvan warship had retreated, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. They would come back. And this time, they wouldn't just demand Karena. They would destroy anyone who stood in their way. He glanced back at her. Karena sat on the edge of the cot, her silver eyes staring at the floor. Her blue skin still looked pale, her body weak from the battle. But something in her posture had changed. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a fugitive. "You should get some rest," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Karena lifted her gaze to him. "I cannot rest. Not while they are still hunting me." Ethan sighed. He understood the feeling all too well. "They can't track us. Not right now. We damaged their ship enough to slow them down." Karena shook her head. "You do not understand. The Salvan do not need ships to find me." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then spoke softly. "They can hear me." A cold chill ran through Ethan's body. "You mean they're still connected to you?" "Not completely," she admitted. "I cannot hear them anymore, but I feel them. Their thoughts are reaching for me, trying to find me. If I am not careful, they will." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just about outrunning them. It was about hiding her mind from them. But how could they do that? A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Carter," Captain Work's voice came through the intercom. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan sighed and glanced at Karena. "Stay here. I'll handle it." She hesitated. "Be careful." Ethan gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out of the room. A difficult decision. In the captain's office, Rourke stood with his arms crossed. His expression was grim. "You know what I'm going to say," Rourke started. Ethan nodded. "You want to turn her in." Rourke exhaled sharply. "I don't want to, Carter, but I have to think about this crew. If the Salvan come back with a full fleet, we won't survive. She's their target, not us." Ethan clenched his fists. "She's not a criminal. She's one of us now." "She's an alien defector," Rourke corrected. "And if we keep her, we're declaring war." Ethan slammed his hands on the desk. "You saw how they treated her. They don't want to bring her home. They want to erase her." Rourke didn't flinch. "I know, but that doesn't change the facts. We can't protect her, Carter. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and we don't even know how they're tracking her." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So what's your solution? Hand her over and hope they spare us." Rourke looked him in the eye. "We drop her off somewhere safe. Somewhere far." Ethan was silent. "This isn't betrayal," Rourke said, his voice softer. "It's survival." Ethan shook his head. "No, it's running." Rourke sighed. "I'm giving you 12 hours to figure something out. After that, we decide as a crew." Ethan didn't wait to argue. He turned and stormed out of the room. A desperate plan. Karena was waiting for him when he returned. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it on his face. "They are afraid," she said softly. Ethan sat down with a heavy sigh. "They don't think we can protect you." Karena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Perhaps they are right." Ethan's head snapped up. "You can't mean that." Karena looked away. If I stay here, your people will suffer. The Talvin will never stop hunting me. Ethan shook his head. So what? You just let them take you. Let them erase you. She met his gaze. Then what do we do? Ethan exhaled, thinking. He needed a way to hide her from their minds. If the Talvin were tracking her through their mental link, they needed something to block it. And then it hit him. The Talvin don't understand human minds, he muttered. They fear our emotions, our unpredictability. Karenna frowned. Yes. What are you thinking? Ethan leaned forward. What if we could break their connection to you? What if we could make your mind unreadable to them? Karenna's eyes widened. That is possible, but it is dangerous. How? Karenna hesitated. Xalvan minds are logical, structured. If my thoughts become too chaotic, too human, they will lose their grip on me. Ethan smirked. Then let's teach you how to think like a human. Karenna blinked in surprise. You mean emotions? Ethan nodded. Exactly. If we make your mind unpredictable, the Talvin won't be able to track you. They won't understand you. Karenna was silent. Then, for the first time, she smiled. I want to learn. Ethan grinned. Good, because we don't have much time. Karenna sat across from Ethan in the small mess hall of the Vanguard, her silver eyes staring at him with deep curiosity. A steaming cup of coffee sat in front of her, untouched. You have to drink it, Ethan said, smirking. Karenna tilted her head. Why? Ethan chuckled. Because it's part of being human. Coffee keeps us awake, helps us think. She hesitated, then carefully lifted the cup. The moment the bitter liquid touched her tongue, her eyes widened in shock. She quickly set the cup down, coughing. This is terrible, she gasped. Ethan burst into laughter. Yep. And yet humans drink it every day. Karenna wiped her mouth, shaking her head. Your species is strange. Ethan leaned forward. That's the point. If you want to hide from the Xalvan, you have to be unpredictable. You have to think and act like a human. Karenna nodded, but her face was serious. But how do I change my mind? Xalvan do not experience emotions as you do. Our thoughts are logical, ordered. Yours are chaotic. Ethan grinned. Exactly. And that's why they can't track us. She frowned. So how do I make my thoughts chaotic? Ethan thought for a moment. We start with emotions. Humans don't just think, we feel. Joy, anger, fear, excitement. We act based on instinct, not just logic. Karenna folded her arms. Xalvan see emotions as weakness. Ethan leaned back. And that's why they don't understand us. But emotions are also strength. They make us fight harder, protect the people we care about. Karenna was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, Teach me. A lesson in chaos. For the next few hours, Ethan did his best to teach Karenna how humans thought and felt. He showed her music, explaining how humans used it to express emotions. This song, Ethan said, playing a fast-paced rock tune, makes people feel energized. Karenna listened carefully, tapping her fingers on the table. It is unpredictable. Ethan grinned. Exactly. Now this one. He switched to a slow, soft melody, makes people feel calm. Karenna's silver eyes softened. This is pleasant. Ethan nodded. See, you're starting to feel it. Then he moved on to humor. He told her a joke, the simple one. Karenna blinked. I do not understand. Ethan laughed. Okay, let's try again. He acted out a funny scene, pretending to trip over a chair in an exaggerated way. Karenna's lips twitched. For a second, Ethan thought she might actually laugh. Then, suddenly, her face changed. She gasped, gripping her head. Ethan rushed to her side. Karenna, what's wrong? She closed her eyes tightly. They are searching for me. Ethan tensed. Can they find you? Karenna took a deep breath. No, but they are confused. My thoughts are different now. It is working. Ethan sighed in relief. Good, but we need to keep going. The captain's ultimatum. Hours later, the ship's intercom buzzed. Carter, bring Karenna to the bridge. It's time. Ethan's stomach sank. He had almost forgotten. The captain was going to decide her fate. Karenna looked at him. They will choose to leave me behind. Ethan clenched his fists. Not if I can help it. Together, they walked to the bridge. The entire crew was waiting. Captain Rourke stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The Colvin will return, Rourke said. We can't afford to fight them again. So we have to decide. Do we keep her, or do we leave her somewhere safe? The crew murmured amongst themselves. Some looked uncertain. Others looked afraid. Ethan stepped forward. She's one of us now. We can't just abandon her. A crew member frowned. But they're tracking her. We don't stand a chance if they bring more ships. Ethan took a deep breath. They're not tracking her anymore. The room fell silent. Rourke raised an eyebrow. Explain. Karenna stepped forward. Her silver eyes no longer looked lost or afraid. There was determination in them now. I have changed, she said firmly. I do not think as I once did. My thoughts are no longer Xalvan. They cannot find me anymore. The crew exchanged glances. Rourke studied her carefully. And how do you know that? Karenna took a deep breath. Because for the first time, I feel. She looked at Ethan, and for the first time she smiled. I understand now. Humans are not weak because of emotions. You are strong because of them. Rourke sighed, rubbing his temples. This is a dangerous choice. Ethan nodded. But it's the right one. Rourke was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he looked at Karenna. You stay, he said. But if this goes bad, Carter, it's on you. Ethan grinned. I wouldn't have it any other way. Karenna looked at him, gratitude shining in her silver eyes. She was no longer alone. She had found her place. And for the first time, she was free. Karenna walked down the corridors of the Vanguard, her silver eyes scanning the busy crew members as they moved past her. It had been 3 days since Captain Rourke allowed her to stay, and she was still adjusting to life among humans. She had spent her entire existence following logic, living under the strict order of the Xalvan. But here, things were different. Humans laughed, argued, and made quick decisions based on feelings. And strangely, she liked it. Ethan had been helping her understand these emotions. Joy, curiosity, even frustration. And now she was starting to experience them on her own. But there was one feeling she still didn't fully understand. Fear. And today, she felt it strongly. A strange signal. Ethan sat at his workstation in the ship's control room, sipping a cup of coffee when his screen blinked red. A warning alert flashed across the console. Incoming transmission. Unknown source. Frowning, he quickly tapped the controls, trying to trace the signal. Hey, Captain, he called. You might want to see this. Rourke walked over, arms crossed. What is it? Ethan shook his head. Not sure. Someone's trying to send us a message, but it's encrypted. Not standard Xalvan signals. Rourke leaned in. Can you decode it? Already on it. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard. Within seconds, the screen cleared, revealing a simple text message. We know you or they are coning. Run. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Oh, that's not good. Rourke's jaw tightened. Who sent this? Ethan checked the signal source. His stomach sank. It came from a Xalvan ship. A race against time. Alarms blared throughout the Vanguard. Crew members rushed to their stations as Captain Rourke barked orders. Ethan, how long do we have? Ethan scanned the radar. 15 minutes, maybe less. They're moving fast. Karenna stepped forward. They must have found a way to track me again. Ethan shook his head. No, I don't think it's you. Someone warned us. If there's a Xalvan out there helping us, that means we're dealing with a split faction. Rourke nodded, which means we're caught in the middle of something bigger. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life. The Vanguard turned sharply, heading into deep space. Can we outrun them? Ethan asked. Rourke's face was grim. Not for long. We need a new plan. Karena's choice. Karena stood quietly, deep in thought. She had always feared the Xalvan, always obeyed their rule. But now, she wasn't one of them anymore. She was human, and humans didn't run. She turned to Rourke. We cannot keep running. We must face them. Rourke raised an eyebrow. And how do you suggest we do that? Karena took a deep breath. I will talk to them. Ethan's eyes widened. Are you crazy? They're not coming for a conversation, Karena. They're coming to erase you. Karena met his gaze. Then let me give them something they do not expect. A Xalvan, who is no longer Xalvan. Rourke sighed. This is a risky gamble. Karena stepped forward. They will not understand me. That is our advantage. Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. All right, but we're not letting you go alone. The face-off. Minutes later, the Vanguard stopped in open space. Facing the massive Xalvan battleship, the tension was thick as Rourke opened the communication channel. A cold, metallic voice filled the room. Return the fugitive. Karena stepped forward. I am not a fugitive. I am free. A long silence followed. Then the Xalvan commander spoke again. You have betrayed your kind. Karena's heart pounded, but she did not look away. I have discovered something more than logic, something stronger. Ethan smirked. You're afraid of her, aren't you? The Xalvan commander hesitated. Karena pressed forward. You do not understand emotions. That is why you fear them. But I do now. Another silence. Then, surprisingly, the Xalvan cut the transmission. Ethan frowned. What just happened? Rourke narrowed his eyes. They're thinking. For the first time, we've made them hesitate. Karena took a deep breath. Then we still have a chance. The Vanguard floated in the vast emptiness of space, facing the massive Xalvan battleship. The crew stood tense, waiting for the enemy's next move. The silence over the communication channel was unsettling. Ethan glanced at Karena. She was calm, her silver eyes locked onto the screen. She had changed. No longer a Xalvan slave, no longer a lost soul. She was something new, something different. Then, suddenly, the Xalvan battleship powered its weapons. Alarms blared throughout the Vanguard as the crew scrambled into action. Shields up. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Captain Rourke barked. Ethan's heart pounded. I thought we made them hesitate. Karena's eyes narrowed. They do not understand me. So they have chosen destruction instead. A surge of energy built up on the Xalvan ship. It was preparing to fire. We don't have enough firepower to win this fight, Rourke growled. We either run or get blown to dust. Ethan clenched his fists. We can't just run forever. Karena suddenly stepped forward. Then let me try something else. Rourke hesitated, then nodded. Make it quick. A dangerous gamble. Karena closed her eyes and focused. The Xalvan had connected to her mind before, trying to track her. But now she had changed. She was no longer one of them. Could she reach them first? She concentrated, pushing her thoughts outward. She felt the cold, mechanical presence of the Xalvan, sharp, logical, unfeeling. But she didn't fight it. Instead, she sensed something new. She sent emotion. Memories of laughter, music, friendship, of freedom. The Xalvan hesitated. She could feel it. They didn't understand. But someone on that ship did. A voice entered her mind, weak but present. Who are you? Karena gasped. There was another like her. Someone on that ship was different. Someone who felt. An unexpected ally. The Xalvan battleship didn't fire. Instead, its energy charge faded. The The ship remained motionless. Ethan stared at the screen. What just happened? Karenna opened her eyes. Someone is resisting them. From within. Before anyone could respond, a small escape pod launched from the Scifi ship. It raced toward the Vanguard, broadcasting a message. I seek asylum. Rourke's eyes widened. Are they serious? Ethan quickly scanned the pod. One life sign, not human, but not fully Scifi either. Karenna's heart raced. She wasn't alone. Rourke hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. Bring them aboard. A new beginning. The crew gathered as the escape pod docked. The doors hissed open, and a young Scifi stepped out. But there was something different about them. Their eyes weren't the usual cold, emotionless silver. They looked afraid. I am Relic, the newcomer said, their voice shaking slightly. I do not belong with them anymore. Karenna stepped forward. Neither do I. Relic looked at her with hope. Then, you understand. Karenna nodded. Yes. Ethan smirked. Well, looks like we just made history. Rourke sighed. We also just made a bigger target on our backs. The crew chuckled, tension easing for the first time in hours. Karenna turned to the screen. The Scifi ship was still there, but it did not attack. It simply watched. Then, without a word, it turned and vanished into deep space. Karenna exhaled slowly. This wasn't the end. The Scifi would return. But now, something had changed. A new path had begun. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was humanity.